just a little bit about complexity. Oh, here we go. I'm going to be talking about complexity in human behavior today. I first got involved in complex projects back in the 1970s when I was a program manager in the Trident nuclear submarine program. And I've gone on since then. I've managed lots and lots of projects and done quite a bit of consulting in many different fields. And I've seen projects becoming more and more complex over the years, if for no other reason than our business environment and technology has become more and more complex. So lots of us who are managing projects are facing complex business environments, and we end up, particularly in larger projects, with many complexities we've never had to face in the past. Complex projects are essentially complex systems. And we can have a complex system as a complex project itself. We can have a complex project within a complex program. So we have a complex system within a larger complex system. And those are in a complex organizational system, in a complex business environment. So you can see how these things can mushroom. I was asked back in 2009 to collaborate with Dr. Harold Kersner. Some of you may know his names. He's written a number of books on project management, to write a book on managing complex projects. And I hadn't really thought about the subject of complexity before then. So I decided that it might be a good idea for me to start doing a little reading on what does it mean for something to be complex? The first thing that I did was start reading some books on complexity, and Melanie Mitchell's book on complexity was one of the first ones I read. She is one of the teachers at the Santa Fe Institute, and they were offering a course on complexity, so I took the online course in complexity. And the more and more I started learning about what makes something complex, what is a complex system, what are the elements of a complex system, the more I started realizing that one of the most specific areas or intensely complex areas that I had ever experienced in managing projects was human behavior. Managing behavior of the people who were working for me on the projects, people who I reported to, other project stakeholders, and many times managing my own behavior. So that's where I decided I needed to start thinking about focusing my research. I had the honor of being asked to join a group at PMI who was writing a book called Navigating Complexity, and we had a group of people from around the globe who were involved in that. And when we finally finished with, it was over a year-long process, we decided that there were three major areas into which complexity in projects could be grouped. One was human behavior, the second was systems behavior, and the third was ambiguity. Ambiguity and the uncertainty that it created. There had been all sorts of work done on systems behavior, and I didn't need to add my 2 cents into that. But there wasn't much that I'd seen on human behavior, particularly human behavior in the face of uncertainty. Because as we'll see in just a minute, we humans don't really like uncertainty very much. So that's the areas that I focused on, that I decided to focus on. You probably all, oops, sorry about that. You probably all realize that the brain is what controls our behavior, controls everything that we do. So let me talk very briefly about 4 major things that guide how our brains work. Now, this is important for us to know as project managers because our brains work incredibly well most of the time, usually except when we have to make big decisions. So 4 areas that I'll talk about very briefly, as you can see up here: evolution of the brain, safety first, negativity biased, and the fact that most of the operations that happen in the brain happen non-consciously. We're not aware of them. Let me just mention something about this slide. I had already put my slide set together and sent it into ISIPM, and I called my wife in and I said, "Tell me if you think the women in the audience will be offended by this slide." And she said, "What do you think?" So I wasn't, I have to apologize to the women in the audience. This just depicts women, how some women act, these 2 in particular, when dealing with modern technology, not in always the best way. But I can assure you that we men also act abominably behind the wheel and do things that are even stupider than this. So what this slide is meant to signify is that our brains have evolved for over 1.5 million years. For most of that period of evolution, people existed, the brain existed in an environment where things happened very, very slowly. Change, if it occurred at all, was not quick. Since the Industrial Revolution and up through today, things have been changing at a much more rapid pace. And consequently, our brains haven't been able to catch up with that rapid pace of evolution. So that's the first principle. The second principle is that what our brain tries to do is to make sure that we, each of us humans, can pass our genes on to our offspring, safeguard them, and try to make sure that our genes pollute the gene pool as much as possible. And in order to do that, we have to keep ourselves safe. This is a model that the Academy of Brain-Based Leadership uses. It's called the safety model. And there are a number of different areas in which the brain looks for threats to our survival. The first is security, and in security, what we're really looking at there is consistency, commitment, clarity, and certainty. We don't, as I mentioned before, we don't like change. And when change happens, except for some of us, like Becky, who thrive on change, when change happens, we tend to be very upset by it. Fairness, everyone can understand this. We like to be in an environment where we think that outcomes are fairly distributed to ourselves and others with whom we're involved. Esteem, this is how we view ourselves, how we think others view us as well. Trust, whether we can trust people with whom we interact. This is one of the origins of what's called the in-group, out-group bias. We tend to favor people from our own kin groups and people with whom we work, and we distrust people who we've never met before, and our brain considers them a potential threat. And lastly, that signifies that every person has a different threat profile. So while I may, in my actual profile, fairness is my biggest concern, the biggest threat to me, other people may view esteem as a big threat to them. So these threat profiles are developed through genetics, through our body chemistry, how we're raised in our personal experiences. The brain also has a negativity bias. We tend to look for threats more than we look for rewards or opportunities. There's 5 times more effort that the brain expends in looking for threats than it does for rewards or opportunities. And finally, most of the things that happen in our brain happen non-consciously. We're not consciously aware of them. The decisions that we make are made by our brains milliseconds before we think that we've made the decision. So these all present difficulties since the brain has not evolved as quickly as society and technology has. The brain may perceive something that's a threat, which in present-day society may not be a threat, but we react to it just the same. The brain goes into fight, flight, or freeze mode, and our blood pressure starts rising. We're prepared to do whatever we need to do, even though there is no physical threat to us. These non-conscious, the non-conscious processing the brain does, as I said, has evolved over a long time, and there are lots of shortcuts or heuristics that the brain has developed so that we can function during the day, from the time we get up in the morning until the time we go to sleep at night. Most of those shortcuts work really well. There are some shortcuts that are distorted, and those we call biases. Biases are a problem because they directly they affect the threats that we feel. They make us make wrong decisions. So one example of a bias could be that, let's say I'm trying to lose weight, and I decide I'm going on a diet. I'm not going to eat any pastry or any sweets for 2 or 3 months to see how much weight I can take off. And then I go down to lunch today, where the speakers were having lunch, and I see 3 lovely little desserts out there that I would love to get my hands on. And my brain is telling me, you need to have those. You need to have those. That's a bias. It may not be good for us, but our brain has already made the decision that I'm going to have that. So how do these biases affect project management? There are over 150 biases, and we can't get into most of them today, but let me just mention 2 that are fairly prominent. Optimism bias and planning fallacy. Now, these actually affect all of us when we're trying to decide how much something is going to cost us to do, how long it's going to take, and what the benefits might be. So when an organization, as Ricardo had mentioned, before we start managing projects, before the project is chartered, There's all sorts of work that goes into deciding what the budget's going to be, what the schedule is going to be. And the people who make those decisions are affected by optimism bias and planning fallacy. And you can see from the slides what the definition of those are. Optimism bias is we believe that we personally are less at risk of having something negative happen than other people are. And planning fallacy is that we tend to underestimate the probable costs and timing of projects, and we overestimate the benefits. So this presents a significant problem if you're a project manager and your senior management has come down and said, Carlo, I want you to manage this project. Here's the budget, here's the schedule, these are the benefits you're going to produce, get to it. Now you know as the project manager, Carlo knows, that there's no way in hell that he's going to be able to get the project delivered for the time and the cost to produce those benefits. So we have to figure out a way to counteract the negative effects of these biases. There are three major ways that we can do this. The first is to use processes to counteract biases. Second is to strengthen the brain's braking system. And the third is to train the brain to not be affected by the bias or to change the bias so that it will act properly. The optimism bias and planning fallacy bias that I mentioned before, we can minimize the negative effects of those by using external processes. One of them is shown up here, reference class forecasting. This was adapted from a paper that was written by Daniel Kahneman and Dan Lovello at Harvard Business School. The name of the paper is called Delusions of Success. And it talks about how senior managers make these problems happen all the time because of the biases that they have. So what reference class forecasting does is to provide an external view of the project's potential costs, schedule, and benefits. So bringing external experts in and having them develop a list of previous similar projects, trying to place the project somewhere within the appropriate range and coming up with with what they think will be an appropriate timing, budget, and list of benefits. Next, strengthening the brain's braking system. The brain has the subcortex, which is where the limbic system is and a lot of the biases originate, and the cortex, which is where the prefrontal cortex in particular serves as a braking system to some of the biases that the limbic system generates. So there are a number of ways to do this. First, we have to accept the fact that we have biases. Not everyone is willing to do that. But to be human is to have a bias, so please accept it. The second is to recognize when a bias is occurring so that you can correct it. The example I just gave you downstairs, when I was having lunch right outside, I recognized that my brain was saying, Carl, you have to have some of that cake, and I decided, no, I'm not going to have it. And that third piece, my decision not to do it was minimizing it. Actually, it eliminated it in that case, but who knows what will happen when I get back to the hotel tonight. There are other ways of minimizing it also. George spoke about mindfulness a short time ago. mindfulness helps us recognize when the bias is occurring. It helps us step in there and take the minimizing decisions that I made. Exercise also helps that as well. Exercise and sleep both help that. And lastly, training the brain. There are a couple of tools that are available on the computer and also for purchase that will help you think more positively. And the last bullet that I have up there are some video games, interactive games that you can get that will help eliminate biases for a certain period of time. They've been supposedly they help you long term, but I think they've only been tested for up to 6 to 8 months. And they specifically target the two biases that we were talking about, optimism bias, planning fallacy, and also something called anchoring. So, in conclusion, you really need to understand how your brain works, how your project team members' brains work, how your stakeholders' brains work, so that you can more effectively manage yourself and manage them when you're managing your projects. Thanks.